welcome to our chat today. We'll discuss another article by Professor JOSE CARLOS FERNANDEZ, the National Director of New Acropolis in Portugal. I've already mentioned to you that he is a philosopher with a remarkable talent as a writer. And we'll delve into a very interesting article called Murmurs in History, the Therapists. The story of this group is very beautiful, and even more beautiful is the way he approaches this history. We'll chat a bit about some data collected by me, data commented on by him, and I hope you love this story because it is very interesting. Shall we? Well, therapists, in my style of giving talks, as you know, I would obviously start with the origin of the word, with the etymology. The etymology of thera. Therapists comes from the Greek verb therapeuo, which means to care for, attend to, relieve. That's where the word therapy comes from. Therapists, then, initially would be a servant, a server, someone who took care of a temple or someone who was dedicated to a specific god. And also, in parallel, it began to be applied to those who cared for people's health, which is the more strict sense of therapy that we have today. It is said that the origin of the word therapists, which is quite ancient, is very interesting because there are etymologists who say that this must be one of the oldest words in Greece, possibly coming from the Pelasgian Greeks. One of the roots of this word, which is precisely therapontos, meaning one who serves as a squire, one who protects, is mentioned by Homer around the 8th century BC. There are some etymologists who mention that this word, like terapis, meaning servant, might have come from terapny, which is a term, besides being very ancient in Greece, according to one of the great etymologists who deal with this, Van Brock, probably of Hittite origin or another Anatolian language. In other words, it's an archaic word from archaic Greek. Keiko, probably coming either from the Pelasgian Greeks or even through them from some other civilization in that region. Interesting, isn't it? The one who serves, the one who cares, the one who protects men, gods, ceremonies, the one who shields a warrior with his shield, the one who drives the war chariot of a warrior. That's the meaning used. Homer, for those who are familiar, is very reminiscent of an Indian epic. The Bhagavad Gita, where the one who drives the chariot of the great protagonist, who is Prince Arjuna, is Krishna. In other words, Krishna would have the role of a therapist, according to the Greek term. This etymology is very beautiful. And etymologies always give us a much deeper meaning to words, which is why I like them so much. If you care for, if you watch over, both the body and the soul. Both of what we have that is most material and what we have that is most sacred. You are a therapist, or the one who does this for you is a therapist. Continuing, then, we'll see that there was a Jewish philosopher named Philo of Alexandria. Philo probably lived between 20 BC and 50 AD, and he wrote a work called The Contemplative Life. This Jewish philosopher was in the company, spent some time with the therapists, and the most reliable source we have is exactly his. And although Philo, as a practitioner of Judaism, often provides an interpretation that is not entirely accurate because, according to what we know today, there are different opinions on the matter. Today, even Professor JOSE CARLOS bears witness. In this sense, the therapists were neither Jews nor Christians, nor were they connected to any specific religion. They were a monastic group, and interestingly, the first person to use the word monastery was Philo of Alexandria. They lived in seclusion, dedicating themselves to the search for their inner sun, their divine essence, and wisdom. And they likely had this name because, besides caring for their own souls, they were capable of producing tremendous, fantastic healings. Interesting, because it is said that they did not exist for that purpose. The way they lived in seclusion, constant reflection, meditation, and purification was a means to cleanse their vices, their flaws, and reach their own essence. But as they were able to do this work on themselves, to present their flaws, to heal their flaws and purify their soul, this made them knowledgeable of the path. In other words, those who knew how to guide others to also overcome their own flaws and purify their own souls. You might say to me that isn't a therapist someone who heals the body? If you consider the origin of what is called philosophical medicine, or the medicine before that, magical medicine, it very much involves the idea that first you have to heal the disease on the subtle planes, because the physical body would just be an organ of impact. It is said that the temples of Asclepius, for example, Aesculapius in Rome, were temples, where you would have to go there, fall asleep, and dream about the cause of your illnesses on the subtle plane. And if you were not willing to reposition yourself in light of these attitudes, these causes, it was no use just healing the effects. Those who lived there, the Asclepiads, would not attend to someone who wasn't willing to address the causes. And it seems it was the same with our dear therapists. They attended to people, but not to everyone who sought them out. There was a requirement for a suitable character, a certain purification, or at least a desire for purification on all levels. But it is said that when they accepted a person, that person was inexorably healed, provided they collaborated, of course. They were considered great healers. And it's an interesting fact that it said they lived all over Egypt. Philo talks about this, that they had several centers in Egypt, but there was one place where they lived that was the most distinguished. It was like the home of the therapists, and this place was where those who were more qualified lived. I can't help but draw millions of parallels, folks, because this story has so many parallels in every direction, and I think these parallels enrich it. Helena Blavatsky, a philosopher whom I greatly admire, has a lesser-known book called In the Land of the Blue Mountains, where she talks about a group that, unlike the therapists, did not live in seclusion, but were a people very focused on their very pure traditions. And they only received and healed people who were not dominated by vices. And when they received these people, if they were willing to heal, they truly healed. These Tods, or Todas, as this people were known, somehow bear some similarity to our therapists because the root of their healing power lay in their purity. And only those who had achieved purity were liberated. They could be attended to and healed by them. You realize that we will still talk a lot about other parallels. There are many such structures throughout history. Medicine has always been closely associated with both a physical and metaphysical power, guiding one towards the right path. Well, Philo goes on to say that they were different, for example, from the Essenes, who were a bit more active. They lived in complete seclusion. They stayed from Monday to Friday, meaning most of their calendar, most of their time, out of 7 days, 6 were spent in complete individual seclusion. There, they dedicated themselves to prayers, chants, and reflection, trying to elevate their consciousness, as Plotinus would say, uniting. What is divine in me to what is divine in the universe? Trying to find that pure essence of the universe, seeking from it. A portion of this essence exists within ourselves. And so, they stayed there, only eating when the sun set. Their diets seemed to be reduced to bread, water, and salt. They believed that the time when the earth was swept by the sun was a time for reflection. The time when darkness came was a time more focused on the material. As I already mentioned to you, that duplicity of Latin words, the vodium, which is taking care of the things of the soul, and the negotium, which is taking care of the things of the body. For the therapists, the relationship with the sun was something very special. They welcomed the physical sun with chants and prayers. And they also bid farewell to it at the end of the day with chants and prayers. But they said, according to Philo, that it wasn't the physical sun they worshipped. The physical sun was merely a symbol of the soul of the sun, which has attributes of luminosity, meaning wisdom, unity, and is the Manuel Bandera of all life. And that something of this soul of the sun exists within us. Our soul would be the image and likeness of the soul of the sun. So, this symbol of illumination, warmth, and life that the sun provides as an attribute of the soul led them to have this entire devotional aspect. Therefore, the day for them was sacred and dedicated to the matters of the soul. Only after nightfall could they eat. Well, they stayed. In fact, an important detail, which is not even a detail, it's something very important that connects them with the Pythagoreans. In fact, constantly, Professor JOSE Carlos talks about their resemblance to the Pythagoreans. They had women and admitted women on equal terms. They were called the Therapeutides. They lived on equal terms, subject to the same regime of purity, seclusion, and frugal diet. From deep meditation, and when the seventh day came, they gathered for a communal meal. This communal meal, according to Philo, was opened with prayers, followed by chants, then some words from the leader of that community, sometimes even dance, and then they would have their communal meal. And, at the end of the day, they returned to their cells. Mostly later that there was something greater and more important on the 50th day, that is, at the end of 7 times 7 weeks. What else can we talk about that's interesting? Liturgies on Saturdays. And these therapists, as they were called, are said to have stayed by the lake. Mariotes, on the shores of Lake Mariotes, which is located near Alexandria in the north of Egypt. According to Philo, there were therapists all over Egypt. Small groups, but on the banks of the Mariotes River, it was like the home of the most qualified therapists. And many came from various regions to be with them, and then returned to their own regions. There was the place where the therapists with the greatest capacity for concentration and purity lived. North of Egypt, north of Alexandria, around Lake Mariotes. A passage from Philo himself on the contemplative life. I'll read a few small excerpts so that you can get an idea of how he referred to this community. Albert quotes, "Now, this class of people can be found in many places, as it was fitting for both Greece and the land of the barbarians to partake in what was perfectly good, being open to everyone. And there is the largest number of these men in Egypt, in all the districts or nomes, as they are called, and especially around Alexandria. And from all places, those who are the best of these therapists follow their practice. Pilgrimage to a more suitable place, as if it were their own country, which lies beyond Lake Mariotic." It's interesting, it seems that this place was sacred to them, not only because the purest lived there, but for some reason inherent to the place itself. Several times, Philo suggests that this place was special to them. If we look, for example, at various traditions that build temples, and when that temple is torn down, they go and build the same temple. In that same place, a new temple in that very same spot. Sometimes you look, and there's an archaeological pyramid of temple upon temple, sometimes of city upon city, as was the case with Troy. They wouldn't go anywhere else. That was a sacred place, part of the Earth's body, as if you were sticking an acupuncture needle into the Earth's body, a place of special energies. Therefore, this was very common in various traditions. It wasn't just any place. The menhirs, the cromlechs, the dolmens, also from the Celts and pre-Celts, followed this same logic. They were special places, energy points of the earth itself, sacred sites. It's interesting because we can see in Egypt in inscriptions, especially in temple inscriptions, the name therapist. closely associated with the followers of Asclepius, the Greek god, who is actually the Egyptian Scipio Africanus. In Pergamon, for example, in the temple of Asclepius, there was this name, the followers of Asclepius as therapists, and also the worshippers of Scipio Africanus in inscriptions in Delos. In other words, both the Egyptian god Scipio Africanus, a somewhat later deity in the Egyptian tradition, which is actually a union of Osiris with Isis. This god Scipio Africanus associated with medicine, as well as the Greek Asclepius, was often cited. This adjective for his followers. In other words, they were Asclepiads, therapists, or they were Cecilia Meyrell's therapists. In other words, this is the idea of the caregiver, closely linked to medicine, but a broader kind of medicine than the merely physical sense with which we associate it today. Well, who else wants to speak? We talked about Philo. It's quite an interesting book, worth getting to know, although, as Jose Carlos, our professor, mentions, he was not an initiated, in quotes, one who delved into the deepest mysteries of the therapists, but rather a visitor. Therefore, he saw and interpreted according to his own values. But in any case, it is the most reliable source we have. That you also have, for example, Eusebius of Caesarea, a Catholic priest who lived in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. At that time, it's interesting because people began to talk about and associate with therapists. To Christians, to sects, to early Gnostic Christian groups. Philo himself associates a Jewish group. And then the Christians began to say it was a Christian sect. So Eusebius of Caesarea, in his ecclesiastical history, refers to the therapists as the first Christian monks. Later, you will also see a hunter of heresies, Epiphanius of Salamis, who wrote a book called Panarion, which was a guide on how to identify and pursue sects. He speaks once again of the therapists as a Christian sect. Later, Pseudo-Dionysius, referring again to the 5th century, mentions Philo's work once more, saying that these therapists, or servants, which is one of the etymologies of the name, who were also known as servants or as monks, the first inhabitants of monasteries, the first to use this word, which later became so widely used. They were an ascetic, Christian order, highly organized. In the centuries following the disappearance of the therapists, they were somewhat like Gregorio de Matos to those who spoke of them. The Jews claimed they were Jews, the Christians claimed they were Christians. It seems like neither one nor the other, although sometimes they made references to characters, mostly from the Old Testament, evidently. It wasn't too long ago, at the beginning of the Christian era. But they weren't necessarily tied to that religion. Right. There is a book that is perhaps attributed to them. Perhaps. There is no proof. Some say yes, others say no, which is called the Testament of Job. No, it's not the book of Job from the Bible. The Testament of Job is a book estimated to have been written from the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. In other words, a margin of error of 2 centuries. And it tells a story of Job, but a bit different from the one in the Bible. It places great importance on the feminine aspect of Job, his wife, sees and highlights Job's confrontation with the demonic being, Satan, but in a very curious way. It shows that Job fell into disgrace for having destroyed a temple. A pagan, non-Jewish temple. Look at this curiosity. As if his sin was precisely not respecting the faith of other peoples. And Job, with all his patience, submits to the trials he faces, subjected to this Satan who pursues and tests him. He triumphs not just through faith, but through patience, perseverance, and the steadfastness to reclaim his path. This book is very interesting, and it still exists today. He was declared heretical in the 5th century, But after that, in 1833, it was revisited once again and considered as a book, let's say, legitimate, not part of the scriptures, but as a legitimate book. And this book, they say, well, it can't be from the Therapeuti because it talks about the gift of tongues. I looked into this passage and the Testament of Job, and it doesn't exactly talk about the gift of tongues. That was a somewhat literal interpretation. The Testament of Job, at a certain point, says that women should wear colored cords under their clothes, beneath their breasts, as a way for them to learn to understand the language of angels, which is to speak the language of the angels. Look, this idea of tying cords under the clothes, somewhere on the torso, dividing an upper and a lower part, usually near the diaphragm, was something practiced by various other movements, including the Templars themselves. In general, this was a method for a person, through the sensitivity of their skin, to remember where the division between their animal self and their human self lies, and learn to recognize the actions, appeals from one and the other. In other words, the voices of the angels, they were probably talking about the voices of our own conscience. Angelic, purer, more elevated, when we know how to divide the two worlds and give primacy to the human self over the animal self. So, I'm here to assert whether the Testament of Job is or isn't from the Therapeuti, but for sure, this passage doesn't prove much. It's a possibility that this ancient book, which indeed cites many passages from the Old Testament, might have been crafted by them. But nothing is proven. Well, according to Professor JOSE Carlos, a name frequently used during that time and later on, Cecilia Meirelles, they were lovers of truth. It seems that this was their identity. Much later, in the Neoplatonic school, the eclectic school of Alexandria, Sacred Manius, they also used this name, Philolithes, seeker of truth. It seems that their bond was the pursuit of this inner sun, the quest for human truth and the truth of the universe. They were very autonomous, not adhering to any conventional rites of any established religion, and they had a very well-defined goal. The inner life, the quest for being, in the universe and within themselves, and the union of these two cores. This made them men who knew how to walk this path. From the moment of addiction, of decline, to the rise of consciousness, from illness to healing. This made them become therapists in the modern sense, capable of healing. Those who wished to understand the source of the illness and truly wanted to be healed. Philo would say that they were magicians, prophets, interpreters of dreams, meaning, it seems they had paranormal powers. But very reserved, nothing they flaunted outwardly, and they were capable of healing both body and soul. Another interesting quote from the book The Contemplative Life by Philo. The vocation of these philosophers is indicated by the name Therapeuti and Therapeutrides, which is their true name, because they profess an art of healing that is better than that practiced in the cities, which only heals the bodies. While theirs also heals souls oppressed by nearly incurable ailments, such as pleasures, desires, afflictions, fears, greed, madness, injustices, and a multitude of other passions. Quite interesting, isn't it? I've already talked to you about this idea of sun worship, and I find it interesting for you to look into other traditions. For example, pre-Columbian American traditions, the Incas seemed to do this, to receive the sun. In fact, they considered themselves children of the sun, children of Inti. Native Americans also spoke about this, the reception of the sun. And you will see some quotes among the Celtic peoples, which I find very beautiful, that say the following, that the moment when dawn breaks, and the moment when night falls is a contrast between light and shadow. It's the most opportune moment, of course these are my words, but the most opportune moment for you to discover that the world as a whole is an illusion. In the contrast between the lights and the shadows, which is this moment of dusk or dawn, you realize that the atmosphere becomes a bit dreamlike. Did you wake up very early? That gray atmosphere of the early morning that is just breaking dawn. It all seems like a dream. Or that yellowish light that bathes a landscape when the sun sets. Doesn't it also seem like a dream? They say it's a dream, that it's at this time you see better. Because the contrast of the two planes allows you to see better. This seems a lot like the Eastern impact theory, which says that consciousness is born from contrast. I always return to that idea, which says that all those who climb the mountain of knowledge find very similar things. In other words, in every corner of the world, those who have sought wisdom selflessly, out of duty and fraternity, end up finding very similar things. There's a quote attributed to Albert Einstein. I haven't really gone out of my way to verify if it's truly his, but it's a quote attributed to Einstein that says future scientists will arduously climb the mountain of knowledge. When they reach the top, they will find the wise ones of the past comfortably seated. Whoever said that, from what little I know of all these compared traditions, it's a good possibility, folks. It's quite interesting and very likely. Well, at dusk, they would ensure, before sleeping, that their soul was free from the weight of the senses and sensations, so that it could then rest pure. This provides that restorative sleep, which allows the soul to awaken, replenished with the energy to continue its arduous quest, the most arduous of all quests, the search for the secret of life. The search for the truth of life. It's interesting, I usually call this the sleep of the just. Which is exactly you. Being at peace with heaven and earth, and be able to surrender to a restorative sleep. Without guilt, without tribulations, without arguments with your pillow. Once again, Helena Blavatsky, in one of her works, advises something similar. She says, when you wake up in the morning, as you open your eyes, even if just for a few seconds, think of God. I find this interesting, both for the entry of waking consciousness, this highly luminous and purifying idea, as well as for the entry of dream consciousness, the time of sleep. It's something that bathes the shadows. The sacred and the profane do not coexist in the same environment. When you draw upon something so luminous and pure, the shadows tend to retreat. And this ability to begin in a luminous way. A new stage of consciousness, whether waking or dreaming. How did they dress? It is said that they wore white linen tunics, a symbol of purity, and over these tunics they would often wear, as a distinctive and talisman, the so-called small double-edged axe, which in Greece was called a labrys. It was with one of these double-edged axes that Theseus killed the Minotaur. The Minotaur in the labyrinth, which, by the way, the word labyrinth comes from the word labrys, the double-edged axe. In saying that they used it with the same meaning, but it is indeed a recurring symbol. The Minotaur of Crete is often depicted with this labrys in front of its chest. It can only be overcome, this beastly thing that enslaves man, with simultaneous internal and external work, the double-edged axe. And so they carried this symbol. We cannot assert what symbolism it held for them, but it is a symbol quite recurrent in traditions. And they say, as Professor JOSE Carlos mentions, that they used this symbol in reference because it was a symbol of great kings in history. And what they intended was precisely to reign over themselves. The knowledge and mastery of oneself. Know yourself, master yourself, transform yourself. Well, it seems they had two sacred numbers, as I already mentioned to you, the 7. And then there exists a long set of traditions that work with the idea of 7 as sacred. India represents with the 7 what we call the septenary constitution, which are the 7 planes of manifestation. The 7 is included among the sacred numbers in various traditions. and in addition with the number 50. As I mentioned to you, for 7 times 7 weeks, that is, 49 days, they practiced. Their abstinences, their seclusion, with joint ceremonies only on the 7th day. When these 49 days ended, the 50th, it was the day they gathered to hold a special celebration. And this special celebration consisted of holding a vigil throughout the night, dancing, singing, reciting their prayers until the reception of the sun the next day. I won't go on about this again for you, but the 49, for those who have read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Doro, the 49 is the number of days that the officiant reads the Bardo for the beings who has just passed away. The 49, 7 times 7, is often associated with the septenaries of human life until reaching, completes maturity at 49 years. Have you ever stopped to wonder why adulthood is at 21 years and not 20? It would be the 3rd septenary. Many traditions talk about this, and in the 7th septenary, many things are completed and, from there, they develop. As if it were also a woman's pregnancy, that many things are completed in the 7th month, and from there, it's a development. Gain in weight, gain in size, but a lot is already ready there. This number is everywhere. It's very interesting, this recurrence of secret symbols. And Professor Jose Carlos will also refer to 2 other fraternities whose fundamental theme, just like our therapists, was the idea of purity. First, the Cathars, who lived in the west of Europe around 1100 to 1200. After that, they were tragically destroyed. Catharo means exactly pure. Purity was paramount, and they aimed to reach the sacred through the purification of their bodies and souls. And he also talks about the disciples of Saint Francis of Assisi, who lived during the 12th and 13th centuries in Assisi, in what would later become Italy, who also shared this same idea of purification and communion. Not just among themselves, but with all of nature. Now, stop to think that perhaps this is the fundamental message of this lecture. And why do we have a lecture like this, given that we are a school of philosophy? What is the practical use of this? Consider that the path to healing starts from a very deep self-awareness. Putting things in their place, in other words, purification doesn't mean, for example, eliminating things, but placing everything where it belongs. The Platonic sense of justice, which is order. When everything is in its place, there is no evil in the universe. So, that stubbornness of yours can be transformed when it works towards a human goal and can turn into determination. That passionate, irascible tendency can be transformed into enthusiasm, into drive, when they are put in service of a human goal, a sacred goal, in the quest for our own essence, our own being. Putting everything in its place. To make us become. The centaur, where the human dominates the animal, and not the minotaur, where the animal dominates the man. This minotaur, which was exactly dominated by the double-edged axe. In other words, healing, something we've talked so much about these days, works in a process of wanting to purify everything that, on subtle levels, begins to make us ill. Perhaps consider that our body is an organ of impact, of many things that happen on the subtle plane. Here with my philosophical musings, because that's what a philosopher does, never stop speculating, I find myself pondering the behavior, for instance, of a cancer cell. How it disregards everything and everyone around it and wants to prevail over all. Doesn't that seem a lot like the psychological behavior of selfishness? When you consider, for example, a heart problem which claims so many lives in our historical moment, we cannot forget this. Doesn't it resemble the behavior of someone who hates? And does this affect, above all, your heart? And so it goes. You'll see that this isn't so crazy after all. Indian Ayurvedic medicine and other Eastern medicines spoke of very similar things. In other words, if we start on the subtle plane, a knowledge of ourselves, a mastery of ourselves, an organization where we put everything in its place, and a meeting with our true identity. In other words, it's not a transformation, it's not change in form, it's transmutation. To transition from a rational animal to a true human being. Because when we are, like animals, in the worst sense of the word, that is, guided only by instincts, and when reason comes and amplifies these instincts, we become terrible. If we're going to be animals, it's better to take away reason. Because reason amplifies instincts and makes us the greatest predators on earth. So, instead of being rational animals, we should have principles that govern reason and guide instincts. Everything integrated, everything harmonized. Perhaps, who knows, this might be a great factor of immunity, a great factor of health. We are living in a historical moment where psychosomatic illnesses are no longer considered a fantasy. Everyone knows they exist. And if we consider that perhaps there is something higher, something Socratic that impacts the psyche, that then impacts the body, something of a spiritual nature in the sense of values, virtues, wisdom, getting closer to a deeper meaning of life, wanting to make a difference. Could this not be an even more effective form of medicine? What I mean by this is that our doctors are ineffective, far from it, especially at a historic moment like this. They are heroes. Perhaps each of us could develop a criterion to dive into these more subtle planes, the plane of Plato's ideas, and see if we are mistreating our denser planes through an incorrect placement of our identity, through a mediocre knowledge of ourselves. In other words, each person becoming the therapist of their own life, as these men did. And purity, which is the determination for a noble goal, allows us to influence many as well. We can have a beneficial effect. When we have light, and the more light we have, the more we illuminate those around us. This is just a reflection. And finally, I leave you with one more quote from Philo of Alexandria, where he will say, eager to have wisdom as their companion, they abandoned the pleasures of the body and did not desire mortal offspring, but rather those immortal children, which only the beloved souls of God can give birth to, without the need for a midwife, because the Father has sown his spiritual rays in them, allowing them to grasp the truths of wisdom. In other words, having wisdom as their companion, they were able to give birth to many other beings, not through the body, through a physical birth, but through a metaphysical birth that occurs. When you set an example that life has other alternatives, that it is possible to live for higher goals. I remember, of course, and I can't help but recall another tradition as well. There is another quote from Philo here that reminds me a lot of the Tarikas, the Sufi schools, especially the Mevlevi and Rumi. Look at what a beautiful passage this is. They always keep the memory of God alive, never forgetting it, so that even in dreams, the image is none other than the excellence of divine powers. Even in dreams, they work to control even their dream consciousness. In fact, many. In their sleep, they proclaim in their dreams the truths of sacred philosophy, the pursuit of wisdom. See how interesting the idea of the divine, always present in their memory, even in dream consciousness. As I mentioned to you, some Sufi schools, especially within my knowledge, the Mevlevi of Rumi, they had a concept called Dikri, DKR. This Dikri was a state of mental prayer, perpetual. They work precisely with the idea that, within the mental plane, the sacred and the profane cannot coexist simultaneously. So, when you have many circular, polluting, negative ideas, they imagined a highly luminous idea. An image, a presence, a music, a word. In such a way that, when this idea arose, it swept away the shadows. Imagine for a minute that you're caught in a terrible circular thought. And you remember the person who, to you, represents the greatest nobility you have ever known. A character, whether close to you or historical. Imagine this character crossing your mental plane from end to end. Cruzi Souza, the imagination, he enters your mental plane and crosses it. In the presence of this character who inspires you with so much respect, it's impossible to have a vile or negative thought. He leaves taking all the shadows of him, purifying the mental plane. This decree that the Navleves speak of was a state of perpetual mental prayer. They were working, they were building, preparing their food, and they were in a state of prayer. Of perpetual prayer, as the Apostle Paul himself would say, watch and pray unceasingly. And laughing is more than just a mere decoration of a beautiful or very mystical phrase. It's a technique. And therapists also used it and managed to introduce it even into sleep. Do you see how certain knowledge has been left behind? Sometimes I find myself imagining that we live in two very different historical times. Highly advanced from a technological standpoint and extremely backward from a human standpoint. In other words, we live in two very contradictory historical moments. Technology and the means become increasingly powerful, and the men who handle the means perhaps increasingly weaker. They no longer know who they are or what they came here to do. Well, Professor Jose Carlos, as we wrap up our little talk, he recommends, because I know you always ask where to read. Of course, you will read the text by Professor Jose Carlos himself. There, he provides this recommendation and a few others. He recommends a text by a certain author, Dimas Fernando Pessoa Galeano, about a Pythagorean monastery, the Therapists of Alexandria. Making a symbolic association then, he highly recommends this text, which links Pythagoreans with therapists. Therapists, the ancient art of healing the soul and, consequently, healing the body. I recommend reading this text by Professor Jose Carlos, which is very beautiful, and I hope that our little conversation brings good reflections.
What are the questions you use for people? What are the questions you use?
Well, everything we know about the therapists is through Philo, so it can't be very clear. Consider that they were men who deeply understood the human soul because they deeply understood their own. Whoever is deep within themselves will be deep in seeing others. When one is superficial in relation to oneself, a person will always be superficial in understanding others. So, perhaps they could see serious flaws in character. Plato used to say, for example, that absolute ignorance is preferable to knowledge in the wrong hands. Perhaps they looked and saw, well, this suffering that this person endures is the only chance, through pain, for them to correct their character a bit. In other words, I don't know what criteria they had, because the material we have on the therapists is almost nothing. But one thing is certain, they did some kind of selection. Just like the Asclepiads did, just like all those from the Blue Mountains did. This is very common. Just like the Pythagorean schools themselves did when accepting someone. This is a very common criterion. That, in general, as Buddhism says, pain is a vehicle for consciousness. And if you interfere in this, without the person having gained proper awareness, you might be hindering more than helping. Sometimes, that pain is necessary. As my grandmother used to say, pain teaches the frog to jump. And if the frog refuses to jump, maybe you're doing it wrong by alleviating that pain. There is, in fact, a beautiful Hindu tale that you might know, where a caterpillar was crawling on the hot ground, complaining a lot about the pain and pleading for mercy from the gods. And the god Shiva looks at her and takes pity on her. He places a shield on her belly so she wouldn't feel the heat of the ground anymore. And then, some time passed and he remembered, I wonder how that caterpillar I helped so much is doing. I relieved her pains in that scorching Indian monsoon climate. I relieved her pains. He goes back there and sees that she is very happy, crawling on the ground, but all the others had become butterflies. This example, I think, answers well what you asked me.
Yes. The first question. What do you think theologians feel about our realm? In my social circle, theologians are driven by callings.
Well, I don't know which therapists you're talking about. If you're talking about the therapists of Alexandria, they are not underestimated. They are not even known. Now, under the title of therapists in our historical moment, in the dual world, there are good things and there are bad things. We cannot deny that. Now, the problem is that sometimes the bad things demoralize the good ones. The other day, I was talking about this right here when I mentioned a very special person in terms of astrology. She was telling me that there's not much hope for the image of astrologers at this point. Plato mentions this when he refers to philosophy in his own Republic. He will say that, in the future, those who would demoralize philosophy wouldn't be the ones attacking it, but those who would enter because they found the door open and the house abandoned, and from within. They would demoralize it through the insanity of their words. In other words, if all therapists were serious people, if they were people who did serious work, had the necessary knowledge, maybe this wouldn't happen. But it's a very mixed group, as it happens in humanity as a whole. And that really is very complicated. People tend to label. I won't delve into that, but you yourself, being a good therapist, a serious therapist, know that in this field there are many who don't have those qualities, who don't meet those requirements. Nowadays, anyone, sometimes even out of vanity, feels entitled to call themselves a therapist.
Anna Moraes asks, Professor Lucia, does the healing of this pandemic we're experiencing also begin on the subtle plane?
All healing begins on the subtle plane. Now, once it has reached the physical plane, we must adhere to the biblical phrase, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. It has already impacted the physical body, so now we must take care of the physical body, and for that, we have our current medicine. Both homeopathic, allopathic, all of them, that are dedicated to finding a way out of this. But what is on the physical plane now must be addressed with physical measures. Now, if we learn to deal with these more subtle planes, perhaps we can prevent future troubles. Let the sowing be free, but the harvest is mandatory. At this moment, we are already reaping. Mistakes that were made. Somewhere, by who knows who, due to a series of elements, perhaps, here it is well said, the wildlife market in terrible conditions, the disrespect for life as a whole, both animal and human, with precedence, because this had already happened before with SARS, and then there were mistakes. And these actions are now bearing their fruits, which we will have to work with. And that is the physical plane. But in parallel, if we nurture new Cecilia Merals, the harvest will be different. That's right. Remember, always, the dream may be wild, but the dreamer must be lucid. We need to keep our feet on the ground and know that, yes, we can start a process that makes our lives healthier from the subtle plane. But don't think that now, with the illness in our bodies, we can just drop everything and work on the subtle planes. That would be childish. I ask you, my team, to remember to ask you to like this recording and share it. I really appreciate your presence and hope that our chat is useful in your lives. Don't forget to look for the article I created. Thank you very much.